Practically nothing could have energized and mobilized the United States for the Second World War than the sudden attack by Japan against Pearl Harbor. The average American was outraged by the sneak attack, and for many that had their concerns or doubts about entering the war before, now were thoroughly motivated to join the fight. There was actually a strong and significant peace movement in the United States before Pearl Harbor, with many prominent Americans, including Charles Lindbergh, voicing a very vocal opposition to the slightest possibility of the United States joining the Allies and entering the war. President Roosevelt himself said in 1940 that American boys would not be sent overseas to fight on foreign shores. But all the objections to the United States entering the war were dissolved immediately after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Once Hitler declared war against the United States, even more so, the United States was fully in the war in two theaters, Europe and the Pacific, and there was now no doubt that the Second World War would be on an even grander scale than the First World War. The American Homefront experienced dramatic changes as a result of the war with far-ranging economic and social consequences. A total of 16 million Americans would serve in a branch of military service during World War II. Only a small number of them would actually experience combat and fighting on the front lines, but simply being inducted into the service would have profound implications for their lives even in the years to come. Many Americans were sufficiently enraged by the attack on Pearl Harbor that they quickly enlisted in the armed forces, eager to volunteer and eager to get into the fight. Many others were drafted through the Selective Service Program if they were physically and morally qualified. Millions of other Americans did not serve in a branch of the military, but did labor in an essential war industry, including agriculture, mining, and manufacturing. The most immediate implication of so much war-related work was the undeniable end to the Great Depression. The military and munitions production resulted in full employment in the economy. For the first time, many Americans actually had money in their pockets. As a result of federal rationing programs, Americans actually built up savings they would not really be able to spend until after the war. World War II pulled many Americans out of their hometowns and off the family farm to go train at a quickly constructed military base all across the country. The lethargy of the Depression was thrown off, and American males were thrust into rigorous training programs that valued fitness and preparedness. Physical impairments, felony records, and moral perversions could result in a soldier being denied entrance into the military, but most that wanted to serve overseas found a way to be inducted into a branch of service. The United States had much to do in order to catch up to the other combatant nations upon its entry into the war. The United States had one of the smaller armies in the world at the time of Pearl Harbor, but the numbers would quickly swell as more and more soldiers were mustered out for service. The mobilization of American industry during World War II was unparalleled and unprecedented. On a scale far greater than even during World War I, entire sectors of the economy were recalibrated for the production of munitions and war-related articles. Consumer goods, household appliances, and automobiles ceased to be produced, and factories were repurposed for contracts from the War Department. The results were staggering. American industry produced 40 billion bullets, 300,000 aircraft, 76,000 ships, 86,000 tanks, and 2.6 million machine guns. Total federal spending increased by nearly 400%, largely directed towards munitions productions. A particular industrial plant of note was the Fort Willow Run plant in Ypsilanti, Michigan, charged with aircraft production. 67 total acres were combined under a single roof, and production operated around the clock 24 hours each day. The plant produced Ford automobiles before the war, the average Ford car requiring 15,000 parts to be assembled before it left the assembly line. At the height of aircraft production in Ypsilanti, B-24 Liberator bombers were rolling off the assembly line, each of which required over 1.5 million parts. Incredibly, one B-24 was produced every 63 minutes at the plant. American industrial production provided the Americans with an unmatched advantage that the Axis powers simply could not keep up with. The federal government played a very interesting role in the economy during World War II. Congress acted quickly to pass several pieces of legislation that created new federal commissions and oversight boards to ensure efficient war production. Most significant was the War Production Board. The WPB oversaw the conversion of American industry to war production, carefully allocated raw materials appropriately, distributed war contracts, prohibited production of non-essential items, and identified rationed commodities such as rubber, aluminum, oil, gasoline, and plastics. The Office of Price Administration set prices on products and capped rents in an effort to combat wartime inflation. The Smith-Connolly Act empowered the government to seize and operate essential industries for war production that were threatened by a shutdown due to a strike. Similarly, the National War Labor Board was designed in an effort to minimize strikes and resolve employer and employee disputes. In an effort to ensure peaceful racial relationships, Congress also created the Fair Employment Practices Commission, which banned by executive order racial discrimination in industry and unions involved in war work. Perhaps the most notable piece of legislation passed by Congress was the GI Bill, or officially known as the Servicemen's Readjustment Act. With great foresight, Congress acted to facilitate the readjustment of soldiers serving in World War II back into society even before the war was over. The GI Bill appropriated federal money to finance low-interest mortgages for veterans, provided a full year of unemployment compensation, and provided payments for tuition or living expenses for GIs who, after their term of service, wanted to finish high school or get a college or technical college education. President Roosevelt signed the bill into law on June 22, 1944, and it proved to be widely popular. By 1956, 7.8 million veterans had used the GI Bill education benefits, some 2.2 million to attend colleges or university, and an additional 5.6 million for some kind of training program. As a result of the success of the GI Bill, American veterans would reintegrate back into society much easier than veterans returning from World War I. Women around the world played an unprecedented role in World War II as laborers and combatants, and this was true as well in the United States. With so many American males serving in theaters of war, their roles on the home front were often taken up by women. Approximately 19 million women played a role on the home front workforce during World War II as industry workers, agricultural laborers, and office staff. Nearly 1 million American women alone entered work for the federal government as government girls, usually as typists, stenographers, and secretaries. On a scale much greater than World War I, American women filled jobs in heavy industry, serving as welders, oil rig workers, and steel riveters. The iconic image of Rosie the Riveter became a symbol that did represent some, but not all American women workers during World War II. Women working in heavy industry challenged traditional notions of women as soft and weak and only good for domestic roles. Female industrial workers were just one of the ways that the Second World War challenged traditional gender roles and perceptions. Women serving in the armed forces in record numbers also challenged traditional notions. Two popular divisions were established in the Army and the Navy that recruited many women for service. The WACs were the Women's Army Corps, an auxiliary branch in the Army that saw women serve in a variety of roles. Up to 150,000 American women would serve as WACs during World War II. The WAVES, or Women Accepted for Voluntary Emergency Service, was a branch in the U.S. Navy Reserve. WAVES served at over 900 stations of service and numbered nearly 90,000 members at its peak. American women were not assigned combat roles in World War II, but they did participate in the American military on an unprecedented level. With so many males sent to foreign shores and so many women entering war-related work, there were significant impacts on the American nuclear family. Marriages were often hastily conducted and often as quickly ended in divorce. Wartime dislocations sparked an upheaval in long-held sexual ethics as premarital and extramarital sexual activity increased significantly. Children and teenagers were significantly impacted by these upheavals as well. Many teenage boys quit school earlier than expected to take a defense-related job. Many teenage boys were involved in heavy industry at an earlier age than considered healthy. With fathers deployed overseas and mothers working long hours at a defense plant, many American children were often left alone for long hours. Many would have to get themselves up in the morning for school, get ready and go to school, and come home alone to an empty house. They fixed their own meals and tended to the home alone, with perhaps only one parent coming home late at night. Children who let themselves in and out of their homes alone became known as latchkey kids, kids that carried the house key on a string around their neck. Consequently, World War II would be remembered as very lonely years for many American children. The American military remained segregated during World War II, but that reality did not prevent African Americans from registering for the draft and volunteering for service in record numbers. More than 2.5 million African American men registered for the draft. African American women as well volunteered in large numbers. A total of 1 million African Americans served in the Army during World War II. Often the target of racial discrimination and relegated to segregated units, most African Americans served in support roles during the conflict, particularly as cooks, launderers, truck drivers, and grave details. Others served with distinction in combat roles. In an effort to link the cause of freedom that African Americans were fighting for in Europe and the Pacific with the desire for equality at home, a Pittsburgh black newspaper coined the term Double V campaign. The Double V stood for victory abroad and victory at home. Democracy and human rights at home and around the world. African American service during World War II would not immediately spark a civil rights movement on the American Homefront after the war, but there is no question that the distinguished service African Americans demonstrated during the war was pivotal for bringing about racial equality in the decades to come. One group of African American soldiers worthy of particular note were the famous Tuskegee Airmen from Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. Despite the challenges of discrimination in segregated units, the Tuskegee Airmen became the first black fighter squadron in U.S. history. The airmen often accompanied heavy bombers in the European theater and defended the larger planes from enemy fighters. They served with distinction throughout the war, but were often not completely recognized until many years after the war. Native Americans also played a pivotal role in the war effort in a variety of agricultural and industrial roles, but also in uniquely combat roles. Particularly unique and effective were the code talkers, Native Americans who used their native languages to transmit messages that would be extremely difficult or nearly impossible for the Axis powers to translate. Approximately 400 to 500 Native Americans served in the Marine Corps, particularly employing the native languages of the Comanche, Hopi, Navajo, Lakota, Crow, and other tribes to confound the enemy. The obscurity of these languages to the Axis provided a great advantage to the Allies, particularly amidst the speed of battlefield communications. During World War II, the American government contracted with the Mexican government to see to an increase in migrant workers coming to the United States to ensure adequate agricultural laborers. The agricultural sector of the economy was just as important as industry during the war. But again, with so many Americans serving in the armed forces, a shortage of farm workers would have been inevitable. To offset the absence of farm workers, braceros from Mexico came to the United States working particularly on farms in California and the Southwest. Braceros were guaranteed 30 cents an hour minimum wage and promised as well sanitary living conditions and immunity from compulsory military service. Food production became an essential component to the Lend-Lease aid that the United States provided for other Allied powers during the war, and the braceros played a valuable role in maintaining the needed agricultural production. Among minority populations living in the United States at the time of Pearl Harbor, many Japanese Americans particularly did not fare well. American outrage over Imperial Japan's sneak attack on Pearl Harbor provoked popular suspicions of Japanese Americans living in the United States. These were people of Japanese ancestry who were nevertheless American citizens. Many such Japanese Americans were born in the United States, had never been to Japan, and perhaps did not even know anyone in Japan. Nevertheless, they were viewed with suspicion and distrust and questioned as possibly complicit with the Imperial Japanese government. Accusations of spying and sabotage were strong and numerous. In an effort to shield Japanese Americans from such accusations and to prevent violence, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order No. 9066. The order empowered the military to incarcerate Japanese Americans into internment camps away from areas designated as high risk for such populations. As a result of the order, approximately 12,000 Japanese Americans were removed, particularly from the West Coast, to hastily constructed camps in the interior of the country. Japanese American families often had to hastily sell their homes or businesses for a below-market price and then quickly relocate to one of the approved camps. Such internees would lament the dislocation they experienced away from their communities, friends, and families. They often found themselves in very sterile surroundings in the interior of the country, in camps that could be cold in the winter and hot in the summer. Boredom, unemployment, and despondency was often rampant. The Japanese internment camps in the United States were certainly a far cry from the Nazi concentration camps, but they did leave a very bitter mark on the participants that would remain for years to come. Even at the conclusion of the war, many of these families struggled to reestablish their lives and livelihoods. They had to commence orienting themselves to American society in a way they had never had to before. A notable court case regarding Japanese internment made its way all the way up to the United States Supreme Court in 1944. In that year, the High Court heard the case Korematsu v. United States. In this case, Fred Korematsu was a 23-year-old Japanese American who was born in Oakland, California. Korematsu protested the executive order and challenged the government decree, arguing it was racially discriminatory. The Supreme Court, however, ruled against him. The majority opinion of the court argued that the executive order was for military purposes and security and was not based strictly on race. The decision is considered an egregious violation of American civil rights and is sometimes cited as the worst decision in the history of American jurisprudence. The High Court would condemn the ruling in 2018 as a flawed decision. Some Japanese soldiers did not spend the war in the internment camps and actually made their way into the United States Armed Forces. Some second-generation Japanese Americans, or Nisei, served in combat units with distinction with other American troops. These troops were assigned duty in the European theater and not the Pacific theater to reduce the chances for racial confusion. The Nisei that did serve in the armed forces provided a measure of pride and honor for their kinsmen who had been relocated to internment camps during the war. Here in this picture, Boy Scouts at the Grenada War Relocation Center raised the flag to half-mast during a memorial service for 6 Nisei soldiers who were killed in action in Italy on August 5, 1944. The Second World War also had profound implications for gay and lesbian Americans. Whereas gay Americans may have felt isolated and unaccepted in their hometowns, once they joined the military, they may have found other servicemen or women of the same orientation. Gays and lesbians were routinely discharged by the military in the event that their sexual orientation was discovered, but even their discharge led to the formation of gay and lesbian communities in coastal cities such as Philadelphia and San Francisco. World War II was several years before the gay liberation movement of the 1960s, but the war was impactful in that like-minded Americans learned they were not alone and began to form a common discourse regarding their experience.